Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to our study in the book of Acts. I feel like I'm always saying this, but these are some of my favorite chapters, and I'm really excited to talk about the story that they continue to tell. We'll jump right into it. Chapters 19, 20, and 21, and probably just a little bit of 22 I'm going to sneak in there because we're kind of left hanging at the end of 21 with Paul beginning his speech. Before we get into the actual content, I just want to remind us that the Acts of the Apostles is this kind of part 2 of a 2-volume work from Luke, and we're going to see some really cool similarities and connections, parallels that Luke is intentionally drawing between Jesus and Paul. But in general, the Acts of the Apostles is about the work that Jesus began to do. We saw that, or that's the very beginning of the book, and it's being continued by the apostles. And we've seen some really cool stories. We've heard some really great sermons from Peter and from Philip. But now in Acts, and for the last several chapters, and it's going to continue really through the end, we've really zeroed in on the work that Paul is doing and the places Paul is going. But we can't forget that this is just one stream, one of many streams that apostles are going in many different places. Modern scholarship continues to learn about the really far-reaching places that apostles such as Thomas traveled to, and the ways that they preached the gospel effectively in those places. But we are looking at this one stream of Paul, and we're kind of zeroing in and learning a lot about his life. And it's really, really inspiring to understand how God is using Paul, and Luke now, he's using the first person plural. He's writing, we did this, we went here. God is really using Paul to accomplish some amazing things. And it's not just a coincidence that Paul is, and that Luke observes Paul following in the footsteps of Jesus. One of the things that really comes to the surface about Paul is how long he's staying with people. So something like 3 years, we're going to read that he spends in Ephesus, not just teaching, but living among the people, holding nothing back. And this, of course, reminds us of other passages in the New Testament, especially his letters to the Thessalonians. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul talks about how he feels like a father to these young baby Christians, as it were. Paul was definitely a very, very smart, educated man, but it seems that more than anything else, the reason that people were so endeared to him was because of the ways that he opened up his life, shared his life, built relationships. I think that's really, really encouraging and beautiful. And while I'm on that point, it's worth mentioning, we're going to come across a lot of different names that seem sort of random or disconnected to us. But we have to remember that Luke is writing a very intentional, orderly account, he says. And the reason he's including all these names is not just random or to kind of build up evidence, but people reading these works, Luke and Acts, would have been able to find these people, or would have been able to learn about these people who were still, many of them who were still living at the time this book was being read. So relationships and the people involved are absolutely huge here. Now, one of the first things we encounter in chapter 19 is a story about these exorcists, these Jewish exorcists. And I was reading earlier today in the works of Josephus, who is a Jewish historian alive in the 1st century AD, who talks about some Jewish exorcists who were alive at his time. And actually, he talks about one of them who he went to see, and how he very, very convincingly used ancient kind of methods to cast out a demon from a person in front of a whole group of people. And so this is a current thing that's going on here. It has to do, it wasn't happening so much in Jerusalem, but kind of the farther reaching cities of the Roman Empire, where there were a lot more kind of pagan centered activity. So it makes sense why it's happening in Ephesus. But these Jewish exorcists would use kind of special incantations that they believed were written down by Solomon and try to do this stuff. And when they use the name of Jesus, they think, oh, this name is being really effective. Let's throw this in. And we see very strongly that it is not effective. And I know it's hard for us to kind of enter into this mindset from being modern people in the Western world, but we have to remember that at this time there were really no atheists, as we would call them. Everybody at this time acknowledged and believed or was convinced that there were spiritual beings who were active. Everybody at this time, in one way or another, was worshiping some type of spiritual being, whether that was a local god, a family kind of deity who had protected your family, the Roman emperor, or one of the kind of bigger, more common shared deities that was a bit more famous. And that's a good segue into the story about Artemis in Ephesus. I actually learned something new while I was studying and reading this passage. We read about these silversmiths who were making things that they were selling basically to tourists. We know from a lot of extra biblical sources that people would travel from around the world. So what these people say in verse 27 of chapter 19, that people were coming from all over Asia and the world to worship Artemis. That was probably true, at least the known world that they knew about. And so the thing I learned is, today, if you go to Ephesus, I've been a couple times myself, you can buy these little statues of Artemis. But the Greek text is pretty clear here that what these guys were selling were actually miniatures of the temple of Artemis of the Ephesians, which was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Today, the temple itself is not standing. It's completely leveled. There's one lonely column standing up, but it's like put together by these random pieces. But it was a very famous, well-known place, and there's all these legends about the statue, which they quote coming down from heaven. Maybe it was like a meteorite or something like that, and then the temple was built up around it, but the temple itself was the thing that was really famous and impressive, the thing that people came to look at. So that's what these silversmiths were making, is little replicas of the temple, this wonder of the world. So that's something new I learned, something that's really interesting. The theater where this takes place, where these people are gathered chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," is still there. You can go sit in it. It's very, very large, very impressive, and would have been a very intimidating place for Alexander to be, and it's understandable why Paul's friends did not want him to go there. What we see at the end of chapter 19, having to do with, dissembling these people in the riot. We're going to be charged with rioting. The Romans had very, very little tolerance for riots, and that's a common theme in Acts, because the Jews try to get people stirred up into a mob to effectively, execute people with mob violence so that they could kind of sneak by the rules. But the Romans in charge, the proconsuls or governors of different areas, they were tasked with not letting any riots or mobs ever happen. And the way that Romans dealt with that was basically just coming in and killing people. So we see here this kind of threat of violence, and then we see later on when they're beating Paul, the tribune shows up and they instantly stop beating Paul because they're afraid of the Romans. So that's a little bit about what's going on here. Now, in verse 21 of chapter 19, we see, I'll just read it out. After these things had been accomplished, Paul resolved in the Spirit to go through Macedonia and Achaia and then go on to Jerusalem. This is a very, very clear parallel that Luke is making with his narrative of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. In chapter 9, verse 51, we see that Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem and begins going up to Jerusalem. And it is striking. I would really encourage you to read Luke chapters 22 and 23, because there are multiple parallels that Luke is showing here. Just as Jesus went to Jerusalem, even though he knew that bad stuff was going to happen there, Paul also is making this journey towards Jerusalem, not because he wants to or thinks it's going to be safe, but because he believes by the Spirit that's what he is supposed to do. So we're going to see the Feast of Unleavened Bread is happening at the same time. Go check out Luke 22. The breaking of bread that Paul does and that Jesus does around the time of his arrest, right before. The upper room, again, check out Luke 22. Jesus gathers with his disciples in the upper room. And then right at the end of, this is at the end of chapter 21, the crowd is saying, "Away with him." And that is what the crowd says about Jesus in Luke chapter 23. So really cool parallel here that Luke is drawing out, not just because he's trying to make a story, but because really what Paul is doing is a continuation of what Jesus is doing. He is suffering in the same way that Jesus suffered. He is, as he later tells us in Philippians, he is participating in the sufferings of Christ. And he is modeling this beautiful sermon that he gives to the Ephesian elders. Is he was saying that I'm setting for you this example to follow. I'm suffering in the same way that Christ suffered. Really, really cool stuff. We had some questions last time about the Trinity, and those are valid questions. The word Trinity is not featured in the Bible, but that does not mean in the slightest that the idea of the Trinity is absent. And where you see in many places, we are so used to talking about Jesus as Lord and God's Spirit and all these things that we take for granted how significant this was, that these Jewish monotheists, right, are talking about the same God they worshipped in these ways and using terms that they used to use for their God, Yahweh, and applying them to the Holy Spirit, to Jesus, and to God. This is huge, huge stuff. But in chapter 20, verse 28, this is one of my favorite verses. Again, I have lots of favorites. But Paul says to these Ephesian elders, he says, "Keep watch over yourselves and over all the flock, of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God that he obtained with his own blood." Now, God is spirit. He doesn't have any blood. Who has blood? Jesus, his only Son. So right there, in one quick, almost throwaway sentence, Paul is just out of his extemporaneously talking about the Trinity, the three persons of the Trinity. Of course, he's not using the term Trinity, but there it is right in the text. And like I suggested to you all last time, the church spends quite a while hammering out the details of just how this could be, but it wasn't because it was a new idea. It was because they were coming to understand in a very powerful way the reality, the complexity, the beauty, the mystery of the God that they've known, the God that they've been worshiping all along. We get to chapter 21. Paul continues his journey to Jerusalem. He meets with James. He participates in these Jewish rituals that these 4 young men who are participating in the Nazirite vow. He sponsors them publicly. And then he gets arrested and he's accused by these Jews from Asia, the Jews who are just hounding him and making life really difficult. And I was thinking we, in our world today, we talk about triggers, things that trigger people. And they use kind of the ultimate trigger. They falsely accuse Paul of, well, first of all, I'll note, remember how people were accusing Stephen earlier on in Acts? They accused him of speaking against Moses, right? And it's like, well, blaspheming Moses, that you're kind of more concerned about the law and more concerned about the temple. And so in verse 28 of chapter 21, we see that they say, this man is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, against our law, against our place, that is the temple, right? So they're more concerned about the law of Moses and the temple than they are about God, it seems. But anyway, when they mention that Paul is bringing Greeks into the temple and defiling this holy place, that was a thing, that was an issue of concern. But this would have been the ultimate trigger, because not too long ago, not in living memory, but in recent history, the Seleucid ruler, the Greek ruler, Antiochus IV, what he did when he conquered Jerusalem is he sacrificed a pig on their altar in the temple, which was, the Jews understood this as being prophesied in the book of Daniel, sometimes called the abomination that causes desolation. And so that, using that word, he didn't just say Gentiles, he said Greeks coming into this temple. These people are saying this, defiling this holy place. This is actually what the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah is all about, the cleansing of the temple, the rededication of the temple after it had been defiled by Antiochus IV. So this is a big, big deal. And this gets us a little bit understanding more what's going on, why these people get so riled up about what Paul's doing. Now, here's the very last thing I want to say. I know we're running short on time. When Paul, so he's beaten so badly that he can't walk up steps. The soldiers have to carry him up. This is right at the end of chapter 21. And he does something that just blows my mind. He, just like we saw him do in chapter 17 with the Athenians, as he's been doing so much before, he's trying so hard to reach out to the Jews, so hard to build common ground. He's just been beaten by these people. And he stands up after demonstrating that he's a citizen of Rome. He stands up and he says, look, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus, sitting at the feet of Gamaliel, who's a very famous person then and now. And then he says, I was being zealous for God. And then he says, just as all of you are today. And so he's saying, I understand, I get what you guys are doing. You believe that you're protecting the law, keeping Judaism pure. And you believe it's so important that violence is necessary. And there's a long history of this going back to a guy named Phineas in the Old Testament, the book of Numbers. And these zealots, there were different kind of groups of zealots, believed that it was so important that just like Phineas went and crammed his spear through all these people who were doing wicked stuff, they believed that violence was necessary sometimes as an extreme to keep Judaism pure and holy unto God. And this is precisely what Paul was doing, remember, when he was going to Damascus to kill Christians, or to round them up to kill them. And he had a letter from the high priest giving him permission to do this. And so it's just mind-blowing. He's saying, even though you guys just beat me so badly that I can't walk, I understand what you're doing. I get it, because I used to be like that. I used to be so zealous, just like you, wanting to do these things. And then he uses that bridge to try to tell them about the gospel. It's absolutely amazing and beautiful and very inspiring. I'm going to stop there. We've reached our time limit, but I'll see you all very soon.